Hello and welcome to the Virtual Hammer Museum. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Hammer's Public Programs, and I'm really delighted to welcome you all to our lecture series, Rembrandt Here and Now. Today is the third lecture on the great artist Rembrandt van Rijn by art historian John Walsh. In the series of 6 talks, Walsh will discuss Rembrandt's drawings, paintings, and etchings. Part of the talks will focus on Rembrandt works that live right here in Southern California in the collections of our wonderful museums, including the Hammer, the Getty, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the Huntington Library, and the Norton Simon Museum. John Walsh is a renowned independent art historian. He was the director of the J. Paul Getty Museum from 1983 until 2000, and he currently serves on the board of directors of the Hammer Museum and the Yale Art Gallery. After graduating from Yale and getting his PhD from Columbia, he worked as a curator at the Metropolitan Museum in New York and at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and he taught art history at Columbia and Harvard. Since he left the Getty, he's been teaching part-time at Yale and giving public lectures there and here at the Hammer Museum. And last fall, he gave a 3-lecture series at the Hammer on Vincent van Gogh, and the video of that is currently available on our website, and I highly recommend it. Walsh is the author of many articles and catalogs on Dutch paintings of the 17th century and of several books, including the J. Paul Getty Museum and its collections, a museum for the new century. Today's talk will focus on Rembrandt's drawings and etchings, the techniques he pioneered, and how he became famous during his lifetime worldwide for his drawing and etching skills. Next Sunday at 2, Walsh will talk about Rembrandt's many, many self-portraits. It was very unusual for an artist to make self-portraits at that time, and Walsh will explore his motives for doing so and take us through the many images he made of himself over the years. So please be sure to RSVP for that. And please stick around at the end of today's presentation, and John will be happy to take audience questions, which you can submit via the chat window on your screen. So now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming John Walsh.
Thanks so much, Claudia. Welcome, everybody, to my hideout and my workplace at home in the neighborhood of the Hammer Museum. And welcome to this series where we're looking at many Rembrandts, including and especially the wonderful groups of works here in Los Angeles museums, including the Hammer. That's the "here" in my title. And we're looking at what's been learned in recent years about Rembrandt and how our picture of the artist is different now. That's the "now" of our title. Our hope is that when the time comes, you'll head for the museums and look for yourselves. Today, we're going to turn to the works that made Rembrandt famous in his lifetime throughout Europe, not his paintings, but his etchings. 20 years after he died, the Florentine Filippo Baldinucci mentioned Rembrandt's printmaking techniques as the most bizarre manner, which he invented for engraving on copper with acid, a method that he says was all his own, neither used by others nor seen again. Rembrandt used certain scrawls and scribbles and irregular strokes without outline, says Baldinucci, and he created a deep chiaroscuro, it means contrast of light and dark, of great vigor and a picturesque flavor. What struck contemporaries as bizarre was the variety of lines that he drew, from loose and quick, here out the window to the landscape, to methodically cross-hatched in the half-light, to impulsively deep and dark in the blotti. Rembrandt didn't invent etching, although Baldinucci was ready to give him the credit. But he did push its potential for describing the world in black and white farther than anybody ever had. We'll look today at how he did that, and along the way, examine some of the drawings that are the basis for Rembrandt's strength as a painter and an etcher. For now, I want us to examine a single picture, the so-called 100-guilder print. I'll return to what it represents, but right now I just want you to look at the whole thing and some details without any comments from me. You see right away what's important and who. The staging tells you. Christ is the highest, the apex of the triangle of figures. He's silhouetted against a dark niche-like shape, and almost everybody is looking toward him. There are about 36 people here and a great deal going on, but we can make sense of it because important individuals are picked out by being given more detail and more space and more contrast. Other people are sketched in more lightly, and they're clustered in groups like the Pharisees at the left, debating what Christ is saying. The darkness at the far right was created with loosely spaced lines that are reinforced by the lines that struck Baldinucci as bizarre. Deep, dark lines created by the dry point, that is not etched at all, but gouged directly into the plate, displacing copper to the sides of the grooves to form what printmakers call burr. The ink in that copper burr makes extra dark lines. We're going to come back to this print, but first I want you to look at a 4-minute clip, a video made by the Philadelphia Museum of Art that demonstrates these techniques of etching and dry point, and also Rembrandt's practice of leaving some ink on the plate, not just in the grooves.
For both techniques, a copper metal plate is cleaned and the edges are beveled. To make an etching, the plate is evenly covered with an acid-resistant coating made from asphaltum and beeswax. This is known as the ground. The artist uses an etching needle to draw on the ground, and this exposes the metal below. The plate is then immersed in an acid bath. The acid eats away at the exposed metal, creating the lines or grooves in the plate. Dry point is a simple technique that involves using a sharp needle to draw directly into a metal plate, creating a burr, a thin ridge of metal that catches the ink during printing. Dry point was the mysterious technique Rembrandt's critics referred to. For both techniques, the plate is then covered with ink, which is especially pushed into those grooves. The surface is then gently wiped clean with a soft cloth to remove most of the ink from the surface. Rembrandt frequently used selective wiping of the plate to create dramatic atmospheric effects in his etchings. By leaving an ink film of varied density and in different areas of the plate, he was able to create a range of tonal effects, much like those seen in his paintings and drawings. Once the ink is wiped, the plate is placed on the press bed and covered with damp printing paper, buffer paper, and layers of blankets. The press bed is slowly rotated between two metal rollers exerting pressure. This causes the damp paper to press into the inked grooves of the copper plate. The paper is taken off the press and a print is made. The dry point scratches create a softer effect, more like a brush stroke, with the ink being heavier on one side of the line and softer on the other.
A century before Rembrandt, the great engraver Albrecht Dürer had investigated etching. There are 5 etchings by him, in addition to hundreds of engravings and woodcuts. Etchings was a less laborious way of cutting grooves into a copper plate than engraving, but Dürer didn't keep it up. Engraved lines have the advantage of varying in width, swelling and thinning. Etched lines are uniform, but they do let the artist use a looser, freer kind of drawing on the plate, comparable to pen drawing. Dürer didn't care to take advantage of that. Parmigianino's etchings, though, begin to behave like drawings, not exactly spontaneous, but looser than engraving. Etching really got its own identity in the Netherlands while Rembrandt was young. Prints like this little landscape at the bottom by Isaias van der Velde would have suggested to Rembrandt how he could translate his own pen lines into etched lines. That way, drawings like the one at the top could be etched instead and used as multiples, like the one at the bottom, and sold cheaply. Another possibility attracted him, suggested by this great original mind, Hercules Segers, that you might make one-off prints, one of a kind, by etching a plate differently in subsequent printings, and by adding dry point lines, and by using colored inks, and even by adding watercolor to the printed sheets. From Rembrandt's inventory, we know that he owned pictures by Segers, probably to study and to sell, since he had a sideline as an art dealer. From Segers, Rembrandt absorbed landscape ideas and also his business model for prints. Each impression from the plate, rather than being uniform, can differ from the last and be more collectible as a result. And that must have appealed both to Rembrandt's experimental instincts and his commercial instincts. We looked in the first 2 talks at Rembrandt's ambitions and his ambitious experiments in painting during the later 1620s and early 30s. He's also trying out expressive techniques in etching too, and he's doing it with a restless energy. He took an unconventional interest in himself as a subject, in drawings and paintings, and in tiny etchings like the one at the top, just 1.5 inches square. He had a flair for facial expression. And with these little pictures, he built up an inventory of emotional states that could serve as models for his narrative scenes. He was also, and already, becoming one of the most expressive draftsmen in history. In the chalk drawing in the middle, an old man's stooped posture conveys his age, and the chalk lines indicate the volume of his body and cloak. He used the drawing for the scene next to that on the right, from the Acts of the Apostles, where Saints Peter and John meet a crippled beggar at the gates of the temple, and Peter heals him. He's used that little self-portrait etching at the left for the figure of John at the very far right, who's got Rembrandt's woolly hair. He seems to have been experimenting with different acids, so the lines are somewhat crudely etched, and the contrasts are very strong. Rembrandt had a phase of experimenting with large prints, reproducing his history paintings, just as Rubens has been doing very profitably. The first of these was based on the spectacular painting in the LA County Museum of the raising of Lazarus, a subject that has always appealed to artists for its high drama. 2 sisters, Martha and Mary, have a brother, Lazarus, who's sick, and they ask Christ to come and heal him. But he doesn't come right away, and Lazarus dies. After Christ arrives late, he says, he'll resurrect Lazarus. Everybody doubts it because there's already a bad smell in the tomb, but Christ does it. It's a test of his followers' faith and a prefiguration of what was soon going to happen to Christ himself. Rembrandt sets the scene in a cave, hung with the dead man's armor and lit from a mysterious source. Christ speaks the words, "Lazarus, come out." Rembrandt labored over the composition, and meanwhile, his sometime studio mate from Leiden, Jan Lievens, painted the subject and made a large etching of it. It's even more theatrical than Rembrandt's version. Lievens shows Christ in a blaze of light, his head inclined towards heaven, and Lazarus obeying him. But for a moment, all we see is his two hands emerging like a horror movie. Rembrandt went Lievens one better and bigger, reframing his composition to show a dazed Lazarus between two groups of astonished spectators, some recoiling, some advancing, as Christ half turns away so we don't see his face, but only his gesture of command. Hand up, elbow out. Notice another experiment. Rembrandt's supplied the illusion of a picture frame, a rippled black band that imitates the flat ebony frames that the Dutch used for prints and drawings. That, plus the rounded top, claims a special status for the etching. Its format is that of an altarpiece. In the first lecture, we saw the Passion series Rembrandt made for the Prince of Orange in the form of 5 miniature altarpieces with full-blown action and special effects of light from heaven. Rembrandt used etchings to produce a few more stunning spectacles in black and white. Here, an angel appears in the sky to announce the birth of Christ to the shepherds, who are terrified. The animals are too. And the angel says, "Fear not." But the command comes too late. They're almost comical in their haste to clear out of there. This is an audacious picture in many ways. It's a showpiece of animal locomotion and exotic locale, and above all, of nocturnal light effects. Etching this plate required a kind of work that was new to Rembrandt. We have impressions made from the unfinished first state that shows the sequence of the work. He began by sketching the whole composition, and then he went to the darkest areas to finish them. The least important areas for the story, but the most important for that spectacle of light that he wanted to produce. You see a landscape with a river. You see the dense web of lines that he's used to make trees and buildings visible, but softly visible, barely distinguishable. This kind of nocturnal print had been invented recently by the Dutch engraver Hendrik Hout, who used engraving to reproduce small paintings by the German painter Adam Alsheimer. Here it's the flight into Egypt, the refugee Holy Family making their way through the night and past people camped by a fire that's reflected in the water. It's a motif and a technical challenge that Rembrandt takes up in his etching and solves in his own way, even more subtly. The main event in the unfinished state, though, is Rembrandt's marvelous outline drawing of the heart of the matter, fright and flight. This isn't any deep probing of human complexities here. This is just sheer terror and incomprehension expressed with what looks like a minimum of labor. To the right of center, for example, 2 cattle run away. A cow rises up from her knees, and in the middle, a ram charges head down while a ewe looks back at him. A few other animals are aware that something's not quite right, but they haven't reacted yet. Now, if this were a painting, we wouldn't have been intended to see the underdrawing, which is really what this is, but Rembrandt printed this state a few times. quite likely to have a record of it and to display to pupils and collectors and to sell. This is a new way to value printed pictures, not just as finished products, but for the process of making them and for the displays of the virtuosity involved. Well, here's the finished product, where we gain overall unity and a lot of definition. Look at the two shepherds in the center, for instance. But we've lost the delight of Rembrandt's cartoonish skill at seizing form and movement and emotions with just line. Fortunately, you can take your pick. In the second state, besides using a denser mesh of lines, Rembrandt has deepened the darks by using dry point, his sort of secret weapon. Dry point appears more often from this point on. This is the climax of the story of the Prodigal Son, where the well-to-do young man, having left home and squandered his inheritance and having sunk to tending pigs for a living, returns home destitute. His father welcomes him back. When the virtuous brother complains about the unfairness of it all, the father said, "Be glad that thy brother was dead and is alive again. He was lost and now is found." The subject gives artists a chance to bring the story up to date and show boisterous high life in contemporary costume, which is what Rembrandt did in a painting where he cast himself as the prodigal in good times. Now he goes to the heart of the parable in the Gospel of St. Luke, which is repentance and grace. Grace being the unearned salvation that was the core of Calvinist belief. No matter how badly you behaved, a leap of faith would give you eternal life. That became a favorite subject for Rembrandt. Here, reconciliation is in the body language. The son kneeling and leaning forward, father enveloping and embracing him, the two making a single form, unity restored. For help with the staging, Rembrandt leafed through his collection of engravings again and found a Dutch artist who had been there already, Martin van Heemskerk. Rembrandt took over the composition and the poses and the stage extras and brought them up to date. Heemskerk's prodigal may be destitute, but he's still handsome. Rembrandt's prodigal is hairy and animal-like and frightening to look at. Rembrandt's not afraid to inject ugly, indecorous reality when it makes a point. He's mastered a technique with the etching needle that abbreviates wherever possible, getting denser where he needs shade or emphasis, and remaining sketchy in the brighter or less important areas, like the background here. He comes back to this subject in a pen drawing a few years later. The composition is simpler. The extras are reduced to a single boy as a witness. The father holds his son's head in benediction. The son is still handsome in profile. There's less exaggeration. Rembrandt was a great etcher in good part because he drew so well. And here he's using a flexible quill pen with terrific fluency and speed and confidence. Rembrandt returned to that subject near the end of his life. This is a life-size painting in the Hermitage, in bad condition, but a moving image nonetheless. The father makes the most eloquent gesture of acceptance and blessing, like the priest at an altar. I'll have more to say about this painting in the last talk in this series. When Rembrandt etches Adam and Eve, he has a virtuosity and a sense of humor going for him. The bright sunlit background is loose and sketchy. And yes, that is an elephant in the garden, by the way. who was a familiar symbol of virtue. Rembrandt had studied one live in Amsterdam. He outlines the figures in the half shade, making the shadows luminous with hatching and cross-hatching. And closest to us, he uses dry point to fortify the darks. If you look at Raphael's version of this subject, one that artists all knew at the time, you can see that the composition was useful to him, but not the town in the background, let alone the Greco-Roman physiques. Rembrandt's Adam is well into middle age, and he has a very ordinary, unimproved torso. Eve does not attempt the seductive contrapposto that Raphael gives her, not to mention her svelte proportions. Instead, she has the wide bottom and small top that's closer to the 17th century Dutch ideal. Rembrandt had been studying nude models. The drawing in red chalk here at the Getty shows a femme fatale with a snake. She's often identified as Cleopatra, whose legend included her suicide by self-inflicted snakebite, but I prefer her as Eve, being intimate with a servant. The stunning thing here is the psychology of the situation. Rembrandt used a drawing to play with the idea of showing with Adam recoiling in horror at Eve's offer of the forbidden fruit. In the etching, she looks positively sly, and he is the picture of indecision. He's resisting with one hand and reaching to touch the apple with the other. Like a good stage actor, he wavers with his body and his face. It's complicated. I don't want to ignore the third party in this triangle. Satan is here, not shown as a serpent up a tree as usual, but as a dragon here with the huge claws who really couldn't have climbed up there. He has a scaly tail and bat wings, and I think a greedy expression. So there's imagination here and wit, a willingness to put decorum aside and think how it really might have been with our very human ancestors at this critical moment for all humanity, their fall from grace. Well, here's a much less important seduction scene, but Rembrandt kind of imagines it in a similar spirit. Joseph refusing the advances of the wife of his Egyptian boss, Potiphar. The subject prompted quite a few artists to produce mildly titillating versions for collectors looking for a little something more than just Bible illustration. In the middle here is a print that served Rembrandt as a starting point. The painting on the left is by a famous Italian contemporary. You see, by contrast, Rembrandt is explicit to the point of pornography and indecorous to the point of comedy. But I have to point out the pictorial devices here. The snaky, continuous outline from her leg at the far right, through her arm, through his shoulders, all of which expresses their entanglement, and also the darkness of the canopy bed to suggest the sin that she's offering, in contrast to the light that the virtuous Joseph escapes into. Joseph's ups and downs in the world gave artists some other less juicy scenes. He got a many-colored coat from his father Jacob, who favored him. His jealous brothers sold him into slavery in Egypt after he told them a dream in which he would become their leader. Rembrandt painted the study in the left on brown and gray, probably for an etching, but when he came back to etching the subject 5 years later, he reorganized it on the right and tightened it. Well, Joseph did time in an Egyptian prison where two fellow inmates told him their dreams and he interpreted them. The Pharaoh's butler sits at the right side. His dreams, said Joseph, was a prophecy that the butler would be reinstated. So he's looking relieved. The Pharaoh's baker in the middle, who looks shocked, was not so lucky. Joseph said he'd be hanged. The drawing didn't inspire a painting or an etching, but it was a first idea, actually first and second, since you see from a zigzag cut that Rembrandt edited it by snipping off the figure of Joseph and replacing him on another piece of paper tacked on, the one we see. The most ambitious print from these years is this one, a reprise of the Annunciation of the Shepherds in its large size and extravagant effects. It's another scene of heavenly glory visited upon the earth, the moment described in the Golden Legend when the Virgin Mary is on her deathbed, soon to die and be taken up into heaven. It's a bed fit for a queen, and the disciples surround her like courtiers. In the foreground at the left, there's a sage-like man with a large book, as if to emphasize that this event fulfills prophecy in the scriptures. Overhead, angels spilling into the room in a burst of light and billows of clouds. This is the first crowd scene where everybody contributes some personality or emotion. At the right, John the Evangelist flings his arm open in wonderment. Next to him, several women pray. A doctor takes her pulse and makes a show of solemn concentration. A disciple applies a cloth to her face. Right down the line, you can see how much individual character Rembrandt puts into their faces and poses. And he does it again with a minimum of lines. He sketches the angels overhead quickly, making them weightless. And a mass of lines suggests the parting the clouds. All of this makes the strongest possible contrast to the dense shadows that he gives this graphically bound table and chairs close to us, and by adding dry point lines for the darks. You'd think that it would be impossible to make a more ambitious etching than this, but Rembrandt was going to do himself one better. The 100 guilder print was audacious, technically, even by Rembrandt's standard. Never before or again would an etcher create such a spectrum of tones, from light struck to coal black. The composition, too, was a great feat of organization. It was based on figure drawings of models that he posed in the studio. Of the few of those that have survived, this one was evidently early in the sequence. It shows quite a different grouping from any in the print. Several others show Rembrandt working out the group of figures to the right of Christ, particularly the woman lying on the ground. In the drawing at the top, she's sitting, holding her hands in a beseeching gesture. The drawing actually shows the pose and mirror image to what would be in the etching, because it would be reversed in the print. In the middle, she's included in a group, alert, mouth open, reaching up with one hand. But in the etching, she slumps back, and all she can do is make a feeble gesture with her eyes half closed. She's obviously closer to expiring. The etching is only known in a completed state, not in any earlier ones, but there's evidence of many changes of light effects during the work on the plate. Even more, Rembrandt experimented with papers. He used dozens of different kinds, slick and matte, absorbent and hard, German and Dutch and Japanese, white, and all shades of sepia, each giving different effects. He inked the plate differently in many examples and wiped it differently, leaving ink on the plate in some places for more tone. There are about 100 impressions, no two exactly alike. I haven't said anything about the subject yet, and it's time I did. I should say subjects, because Rembrandt combines 4 different passages from a single verse of the Gospel of St. Matthew, describing Christ preaching in Judea to the faithful and healing the sick. The most important passage for this picture is this one. Great multitudes followed him, and he healed them there. Well, that's what's happening on the entire right side. On the left side, there's a discussion going on. Matthew describes how the Pharisees, who were conservative Jews, drew Christ into a debate over whether divorce should be legal under the law of Moses, and the disciples joined in. Meanwhile, there's some commotion just to the left of Christ. Matthew says, they brought children to him to lay his hands on with prayer. The disciples rebuked them, but Jesus said, let the children come to me. Do not try to stop them, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these. And you see Peter pushing a mother away with his right hand as Christ makes a welcoming gesture. Just below where the blue arrow points, there's an uncertain looking mother toting a baby on her arm. Her little son steps forward, tugging at her robe and pointing at Christ. He's got the message. The dog isn't just local color. His form initiates the big upward curve that connects this section of the picture to the form of Christ. Christ commands that the little children be brought forward because they have a claim on life and salvation. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. On the other side are the sick, starting with the standing man closest to him. The shadow he casts on Christ's robe is a wonderful touch. The shadow of his imploring hands and his profile. A person without any power or importance in the world, but one of a multitude of souls who make the claim on Christ. The multitude that says, Matthew says was following him. They're there in the half shadows, bodily and mentally afflicted, some on foot, one in a wheelbarrow. Rembrandt imagines many of them helping each other, gesturing to others, emphasizing their unselfishness. You can see how rich and subtle all this is, how the lines almost disappear in an illusion of pure tone. Behind them, under the arch, you can make out a camel, which would be expensive transportation for poor people. It's probably there as a reminder of another remark Christ made right after he blessed the children. He said, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God. Rembrandt includes a rich person, this fair-haired, finely dressed young man who's withdrawn from what's going on around him. He's pondering his problem as the camel waits at the gate. So Rembrandt's picture is a compilation. It's a scene based on excerpts that he's pieced together to picture the essence of Christ's message, which wasn't about theology, but it was about compassion for the have-nots, the neediest in society. A few years after this exhausting project, Rembrandt made something related but far simpler. There isn't any biblical passage illustrated. The cast is smaller, the architecture is clearer. In fact, there's a kind of stage space and a symmetrical layout that's classical in its geometry and its clarity. It's also about Christ's teaching and its reception in the back streets by an audience of various ages and classes, some absorbed in hearing it and some skeptical and some visibly drawn to it. And there's more dry point here. Again, we don't have any trial states, but just a fully achieved image that Rembrandt could vary by inking the plate differently from the impression to impression and by using different papers. The people are of all ages, and they are wonderful. The child at the bottom who's put aside the top he's been spinning and is tracing something on the ground. The young man at Christ's feet, lost in thought. The rapt listeners. The old man, bored or sleepy. And an elder at the right, coming forward towards Christ. Rembrandt's career as a printmaker is going to end about 5 years after this. And in that 5 years, he made two very large scenes of the Passion that put all of his virtuosity and his historical imagination together. He made them entirely in dry point, gouging lines directly into the plate, not etching it with acid. There are many changes that we can follow through 3 states in this case, and then a 4th state. And there were many variations of inking and paper. Rembrandt shows Christ here in his last moments, when there was darkness over the earth and the veil of the temple was torn, and when he cried out, "Into thy hands I commend my spirit." It was a critical moment for Christian theology. And there's another big moment here. Just to the left of center, the Roman centurion who's watched over all this gets down from his horse and converts to Christ on the spot. This was, again, the all-important leap of faith that Luther and Calvin prescribed. You see this in an Italian print, which Rembrandt evidently used for the centurion's pose here. You see it a century earlier in a picture by the German painter Lucas Cranach, where the all-important words actually come right out of the centurion's mouth across the sky in little letters. Truly, this was the Son of God. Here you see the contrast between the scratched dry point outlines in the upper part, just very little detail, but lots of white paper to convey the dazzling spill of light, and the dug-in grooves of the tool with lots of burr to capture the ink. Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea are leaving the scene, perhaps to prepare the tomb for Christ, which is suggested by the cave-like opening at the right. Look again at the people at the foot of the cross. We look at abbreviations like this with eyes accustomed to it. I mean, we know the story of the triumph of sketchiness up through Impressionism and into our own lifetimes. And we know how Cézanne reduced volumes to their bare essentials. So it's hard for us to be surprised by what we see here. But had any artist ever before this made a finished work of the Mother of God, of an evangelist, of the disciples this way? I don't think so. Look at the group around Mary. You easily see that they have mantles and sleeves and caps, as well as expressive poses and faces, and convincing weight and gravity. All this information you get from 40 or 50 lines with a bare minimum of details and shading. Look at the man on the far right, craning his neck to look up, tilting his shoulders, tugging at his cloak. Look at John the Evangelist, in despair. Look at his expression, his costume. The bright light here obliterates all the detail, and it calls for a skill in transcription that had never been seen before, and in a scene that the artist and his audience believed was the most important event in human history. He made many impressions on different papers, and he made a dozen or so on vellum, on goat skin, which is less absorbent material than most papers and takes dry point especially well. But the burr on the grooves was wearing off, so he stopped and he went at the plate again. He burnished away most of his earlier design and he redrew it, making many changes. The result was a total transformation. The crowd at the left is gone. The cave at the right is gone. He put the centurion on his horse, basing the figure on a composition by the Renaissance sculptor Pisanello, making the man much more prominent, but less emotive. His conversion isn't emphasized as much. And he added great streaks of shadow that swallow up the two thieves, and he muted the bright light with a new mesh of lines. Now it really is darkness at noon. In areas like this, you have to work hard to see what's going on. The effect is even stranger than before, more remote from us, stripped of anything that isn't essential to the artist's purpose, which I think is to stun the viewer with a profound event. 2 years later, Rembrandt turned to another scene from the Passion. It's the same large size as the crucifixion, and again, done entirely in dry point. This is the moment when Christ, having refused to respond to accusations, has been turned over by the priests to the Roman governor, Pilate. Pilate doesn't think he's guilty. And because it's a holiday, he follows the custom of releasing a prisoner chosen by the crowd. The priests have told the crowd that they should pick Barabbas, the thief, and in a moment they will. Rembrandt makes the governor's palace grand and oppressive. And he makes the mob an entertaining cross-section of the populace of all ages, seen from the back, with an unposed, momentary look, and not many faces, just costumes and gestures. On the dais, Pilate, in the big turban, is shown almost sympathetically as he asks the mob to choose between Barabbas and Christ. Barabbas, of course, is the squinty thug in the center. Already a servant at the far left has brought water and a basin so Pilate can wash his hands of the whole affair. Christ stands a little to one side in complete resignation. In this impression, you can see the dry point lines have their blurry, soft focus character intact. But again, after many printings of the plate, we're wearing it down, Rembrandt went over it to extend its life and make major changes too. Now the entertaining mob is gone. He may have felt that it was upstaging the main actors. But in any case, we can imagine that we are the mob that's ready to have Christ crucified. That idea of complicity had been in Rembrandt's mind for a long time, for at least 30 years. We saw it surfaced in the Passion scenes he painted for the Prince of Orange, where he actually cast himself as one of the executioners. He replaced the crowd with something strange and sinister, two massive arched openings into some subterranean place, a dungeon maybe. Between the arches, there's a large river god statue of the kind that was often displayed on the ground floor of Renaissance buildings, but whose significance has never been explained. Rembrandt kept the bearded man at the right who steps forward at the edge, though, his head up in wonderment. You remember how the afflicted man in the 100 gilded print cast a shadow on the garment of Christ, acknowledging his connection to and dependency on the Redeemer. This seems to be what Rembrandt has intended here too. In the 1650s, Rembrandt continued to make small etchings of biblical subjects. This one is the size of a postcard. It isn't a story, it's a made-up scene of the Madonna and Child indoors by a fire with a cat sleeping. Rembrandt gives it seemingly accidental touches of sanctity, her halo, emphasized by the oval window pane, and the canopied chair, like a throne that she'd step down from to sit on the floor in the traditional guise of the Madonna of Humility. Joseph is not divine, unlike his wife and child, and he's sometimes portrayed as a humble, helpful outsider, which he is here, literally and touchingly, outside looking in. What Rembrandt learned in the large dry point prints of the Passion, he applied to a scene of Christ's entombment. He began by printing with little or no ink on the face of the plate, just in the etched and dry point grooves. There's a convincing, bright patch of light from an unseen lantern, and on the vault, subtle play of hatching and cross-hatching. The mourners, huddled up at the left, are each shown with the simplest, most direct outlines. Now, this would be a masterpiece of printmaking if this were the only example. But then, after some more work, he printed some impressions with a lot of ink left on the plate and just a little wiped off. Almost, you could say, painted on the plate. This nearly obliterated the setting. Later states had still some surface tone, still had a mood of deep gloom and sorrow, but had pools of light that have the effect of subtle stage illumination, pulling the key elements out of the surrounding gloom. Well, I've been putting a lot of emphasis on the narrative subjects, mainly biblical, because those are Rembrandt's greatest contribution to printmaking. But he used the medium for other subjects too. Portraits first. Rembrandt became leading portrait painter in Amsterdam in the 1630s, and all kinds of important citizens sat for him. The portrait etchings are mainly confined to Rembrandt's circle of acquaintance and friends. We'll look at his etched self-portraits in the next lecture. One of these men was the tax inspector for the stadtholder of the Prince of Orange, whom Rembrandt got to know through his dealings over the Passion series that he painted for the prince. This man was also an art collector, and it's been speculated that this portrait was a favor by Rembrandt to ingratiating himself, like the painting of Samson that Rembrandt offered as a gift to the prince's right-hand man, Constantijn Huygens. Anyway, it's a picture of the taxman at work with bags of coins and a ledger and staff of helpers. He's splendidly dressed in old-fashioned costume of velvet and fur. It may be a good likeness of Artebogaert, the tax collector, but it's also an inventory of goods that Rembrandt enumerates with the care that he's soon going to be applying to the poor and the sick in the 100-guilder print. It's also a permanent record of this official's performance of a duty to society. A portrait of the following year also shows another man in the performance of his duties. Rembrandt made studies of the man, Cornelis Anslo, who was the preacher of a liberal Mennonite congregation that his father-in-law, Hendrik Eilenburg, belonged to. In the drawing in the center, he has Anslo sitting at a table, gesturing toward a book, no doubt a Bible. It's evidently a study for the etching at the right. The other drawing shows Anslo sitting full length, talking to somebody outside the frame, and again, gesturing. He used it for this life-size painting, which is one of his most effective portraits. A double portrait of the preacher and his wife, Eltje Schouten, who is portrayed as a person in need of consolation or instruction. Anslo provides it, leaning toward her, mouth open, speaking, gesturing to the source of wisdom and comfort, the scriptures, which are propped up and dramatically lit. Its position in this part of three-part composition proclaims it as the source of stability in the marriage. Ephraim Bonus, or Bueno, was a distinguished physician. His portrait, like the tax collector's, has a blank strip at the bottom for someone to insert an engraved inscription praising the man in prose or poetry, which was never added. In this case, we don't have a drawing, but instead something unusual. We have an oil sketch that Rembrandt used for the etching with some changes. The print shows him standing instead of sitting and in action rather than repose. He's worked up the head with a dense mesh of lines to suggest the shifting light behind the interior, and it seems to me, the shifting, subtle mind behind the eyes. In another print of the same year, the technical and the spiritual merge again. This is the portrait of a man who became a close friend, the patrician, businessman, and poet Jan Six. There had been nothing like it in Dutch portraiture. He shows Six unbuttoned, posed informally, in a setting that makes his social status clear, a very tall room with a fine window whose stonework is a bit worn, and on the table, the sword of a gentleman. He chooses to be presented as a literary man, thus the books and the printed matter that he's reading, and also as a connoisseur, thus the painting on the wall, protected from the light by the little curtain half pulled aside. The light entering the room not only lets him read, but it functions as a symbol of his enlightened state. There are subtleties of tone and texture that weren't present even in the 100 guilder print. Look at the highlights on his shoulder and sleeve, and in the shadows of the drapery, which he intensified with dry point. Look at the sword handle gleaming in the half light, and look at the books. Six was just 29 then. He was a dozen years younger than Rembrandt, and he was bound for distinction. So it served Rembrandt's interest to give this portrait unusual attention. 7 years later, Jan Six had another portrait made, this time as a country gentleman in a riding coat, which Rembrandt painted with broad, suggestive brushwork that's close to the limit of his virtuosity. He did that knowing that Six, as a connoisseur and a virtuoso in his own right, would understand this tribute to him. One last portrait of Jan Lutma, who was a successful goldsmith and silversmith. Rembrandt included several attributes of his profession, tools, as well as finished works. The head shows how much shrewdness and kindness Rembrandt could put into an etched likeness. Lutma is still, but not static. You can see he contracts his forehead slightly and looks at us sort of sidelong with the suggestion that his expression will change. And every hair on his head and beard seems alive with energy. Rembrandt had been capturing human quirks for a long time. Portraits gave him some latitude for quirks, but not as much as ordinary people and everyday events, so-called genre subjects. These were an established tradition in printmaking. And from the start of his career, beggars and other poor people aroused Rembrandt's curiosity and affection, and sometimes admiration. These are two pictures 16 years apart, with similar subjects, but treated in ways that reveal how Rembrandt grew and developed as an artist in the interim. At the left, a door-to-door rat catcher is offering his services, but the prospective customer isn't having any. He's making a theatrical face and giving the back of his hand to the rat man. Notice the pet on his shoulder. The faces and costumes seem caricatured, played for laughs, or at least for smiles. And the etching needle is busy with crabbed lines to create picturesque textures. This was all done at the time of the 100 guilder print, this one, and I think you feel its compassionate spirit here. The old man at the door gives a coin to people who come to him, the hurdy-gurdy player and his family. Nobody's dignity is diminished. Rembrandt's technique is suitably spare and unshowy. I want to end with a brief look at Rembrandt's landscape prints, which he doesn't make until he's already 34 and a busy, sought-after painter. You saw at the beginning something of the tradition that he inherits, etched landscapes with quite different subjects and ambitions. At the bottom, unremarkable local scenery by Isaias van der Velde and a half dozen other talented printmakers in a plain style. And at the top, the strange views of Hercules Segers, foreign-looking and even lunar-looking, elaborately etched and sometimes printed in color. When Rembrandt turned to landscape painting in the 1640s, it was Segers' kind of view that he produced. Fantasies of distant mountains and rivers. Interesting because they were not local, not contemporary, but vaguely historical and fantastic. Not so the etchings, where it was local scenes that attracted him, and the sort of plain-spoken vernacular picture language that he chose. He treated the flat, marshy surroundings of Amsterdam with delight in the open spaces and paying a lot of attention to the particulars. The meandering inlet, bordered by grasses and muddy banks, and the dense city, its towers and windmills and ships. Now, did he sit out there and draw right on the etching plate? It's also fresh, you think he might have, although that would have been extremely unlikely. In this panorama, Rembrandt picks up the tradition of wide-angle views like the one by Isaias van der Velde. He makes it seem that the world turns on a single dilapidated farm building. And on the right, an idyllic patch of river as a castle. And on the left, a distant city across the flat land. Rembrandt assembled the view in the studio using drawings like the ones at the bottom. Field notes, you could say. Some, like the Getty cottages, detailing humble and ramshackle buildings. Others, like the drawing next to it, capturing the teasing view of a big patrician house engulfed by trees. This is the most ambitious of his landscape prints by far. Large, with the full range of his techniques on display, including dry point and the shadows. Plus something he never attempts before or after, real weather passing through, with slanting rain and roiling clouds, and the bright sun coming out in the distance. Rembrandt wasn't recording an actual place, but creating a composite that would be a satisfying, credible, and vivid image embodying the benevolent forces of nature. In Calvinist terms, God's gift. Rembrandt walks in the countryside outside Amsterdam, and that gave him a lot of material. Here he seizes on something distinctive about the geography of the western provinces of the Dutch Republic, with water everywhere. Your vantage point is down low, but you get long views into the far distance. And there can be startling jumps of scale in your field of view, like the two boats and masts here, which are an important measure of distance that we're hardly conscious of. of all the etchings, this is the sketchiest. It's sheer virtuosity, a kind of drawing in multiple. That sketchy, open light treatment of a distant view is what you see in another etching of the same year, at a spot in the Amstel River outside the city. But at the left is something entirely different and wonderful. A cluster of trees, including an ancient willow that lets him contrast the prosaic life of the everyday river and town with the complex and mysterious ways of love. Because when you peer into the shrubbery at the far left, there's a pair of lovers, the man crowning the woman with a wreath as though he were a shepherd in Arcadia. Arcadian romance was a kind of literature that Dutch were reading and writing at the time. During these years, Rembrandt was taking long walks, often along the Amstel, and making drawings, which he did for pleasure, but he was also aware of a long tradition in the Netherlands of printed views that let the sedentary collector take vicarious strolls through the countryside. Rembrandt's views are wonderfully economical and energetic. We've seen him draw long views and also close-ups of buildings and even trees with pronounced character, like the elderly willows that line the rivers and canals. Rembrandt takes one of those twisted trees, ancient, but still putting out leaves, and makes it into a saintly attribute. It belongs to the retired Bishop Jerome, who's living in a rocky wilderness and busy translating the Bible into Latin. His tree has been fashioned into a sort of drop front desk, handy for his work, and he's shaded by the last surviving branch that has leaves. His other attribute, a faithful lion, looks out for him. Rembrandt makes a virtue out of flatness, of which there's an abundance all around Amsterdam. Some of the most breathtaking drawings have the most ordinary motifs: anonymous sailboats or clusters of trees with the odd spire or tower, usually with a deep view into the far distance. He seldom uses an unnecessary mark of the pen or an area of brown wash, just what he needs to give shape to a clump of reeds at the top, or the wide expanse of field at the bottom that separate us from the habitation in the distance. For Rembrandt, less really is more. This panorama in Etching is one of a kind for Rembrandt. For once we're above sea level. It's a view of a real place, Bloemendaal, in the dunes, looking inland across the fields back towards Haarlem. Other artists had found this locale and pictured it, but Rembrandt makes a super wide angle view of it. He'd been there. He'd studied it in drawings like the one at the bottom left, and he surely knew Segers' etching, but he did away with the alternating lights and darks, and he relied on diminishing scale and on the diagonals to create the breathtaking sense of deep space here. One last etching to end with. A tiny picture of a goldsmith, not a portrait, but the image of a nameless artist in his studio. His fire for melting metal is there behind him. He holds a hammer, and he stands with his arm around a statue he's just made and put on a pedestal. Not just any statue, but a statue of the ancient personification of caritas, charity, a mother holding her children. She inclines her head in just the way he does. Both of them are parents, the image is saying, The work of art is the child, not just of inspiration, but also of hard, exacting manual work. The man has applied himself to shaping the metal, just as Rembrandt has done in etching the plate. This moment of loving satisfaction with the work is one that Rembrandt understands and can share. In the next talk, we'll return to this theme. We'll return and see how Rembrandt actually pictured himself across 40 years or so. And we'll see what his self-portraits were meant to say about him. I very much hope that you can be here with us and that you'll stay well in the meantime.
Oh, John, that was amazing. Those etchings are so beautiful, and the landscapes at the end, those blew my mind. I mean, they're so simple and they're so exquisite, and I don't know, they're just gorgeous. I don't think I ever saw them that way before. So thank you for reopening my eyes.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, no, it's my favorite stuff, of course. I hope you could tell.
It's just gorgeous. So I am going to ask audience questions, be their avatar. And if you're in the audience and you're watching right now and you're not sure how to ask a question, you might be in full screen mode. If you are, you need to exit full screen mode. And then in your upper right corner, you should see a chat icon, a speech bubble icon. And that's where you can type in your questions and we will read them aloud to John Walsh. There is a question already there, so I'm going to start off with their question. They ask if Rembrandt used papyrus, and I'm going to pile onto that question and ask about the different kinds of paper that he used and what really is the difference between what we know as paper from trees and vellum and parchment and papyrus.
Good. Well, we can cross papyrus off our list because it wasn't imported into Holland, or if it was for some special purpose, but not for making prints or drawings. You know, papyrus is made from the pith of that plant that you all know. It gets very tall and grows in Egypt and was an early kind of paper, but it's not very good. It's coarse, and it doesn't roll. It gets dry, it crumbles. Anyway, it's not desirable. No, it was for good stuff, good paper. It was replaced long before by animal skin of various kinds. What we call vellum often makes a distinction between vellum and parchment, vellum often being calf skin and parchment being other animal skins. Those are highly durable, relatively expensive because they're pretty labor intensive to make, and kind of luxurious, even though they're not the evenest of things, of surfaces, and must pose some problems for printing. I think in the video you saw that they were the printer was putting kind of blankets at both sides of the paper as it went through the press, and also there's also some wetting that goes on with the paper. That ensures flatness as much as anything else. And so papyrus is out, parchment of various kinds, including vellum, very definitely a kind of, yeah, object of luxury. But the papers vary a lot too, in terms of thickness, in terms of absorbency, the ability to take on more or less ink, the matter, and the ability to show really sharp lines where they're needed. So there's a lot to learn from Rembrandt's papers, and a lot of studies going into that, has been going into that, particularly in the last 30 years. You will see in your bibliography or the suggested books, the book by Eric Hinterding, who's a man who's studied, I think, every known impression of every known Rembrandt etching. And cataloged also the kinds of paper that are used, and made a wonderful study of the particular properties. That's also the work of an art historian called Christopher White, and also Clifford Ackley. These are two people who've studied the papers and their effect on Rembrandt's printing techniques. And those books are out. Remember Ackley and remember White, Christopher White, and you'll easily find books by them. Anyway.
And I'm going to remind our audience that John has very kindly provided a bibliography of books that he recommends about Rembrandt, and we've put all of those books on the Hammer website, so you can see them there and select some that you might want to purchase from your local independent bookstore. Yeah. So I'm going to take a liberty and follow-up question with that. I'm interested in the conservationists and the issues that are presented to conservationists with these paper. It seems like it would be hard to take care of. It seems like things would fade. Are some kinds of paper better than others for that? And what are the issues? They all look so brand new, so maybe they're all fine.
Well, I have to excuse myself from the technical side here, but we all have had problems with paper, and paper very often has the same miseries that ordinary artist's paper has. The thing is that we've introduced chemicals into the papers produced in factories for a long, long time, and that has a kind of built-in degradation problem. Rembrandt didn't have that problem. People, on the other hand, kept their drawings and etchings in places that were often very moist, and especially in Holland and England, where there wasn't any air conditioning, naturally. And there's a kind of mold production on paper called foxing. I mean, everybody's had experience with it, brown spots, which are difficult to remove and plague conservators of all kinds. Otherwise, I probably have just run out of my knowledge of the conservation problems posed by works on paper, with the exception of one big thing, which is exposure to light. Everything fades practically, and paper gets weaker, even good 17th century paper, if it's exposed to a lot of light, especially ultraviolet light. The framing that's done nowadays of works on paper by a good frame maker includes using plexi, or sometimes glass, that has been treated so that it doesn't transmit anywhere near as much UV as it would have. Ultraviolet light is the big enemy. And so when you have your work, when you have your old master prints and drawings reframed, make sure that they have museum quality matte board and UV protection in the glass.
I'll be sure to do that with all my Rembrandt prints moving forward. Can you still buy Rembrandt prints? Is there a, tell me about that market.
Yes. I'm going to give you a statistic which still amazes me. In preparing the latest catalog of Rembrandt's etchings, which totals 315 examples, that's 315 different plates Rembrandt etched between 1625, I think, and 65. Hitterding saw as everyone that you can in public collections and even some private collections of Rembrandt etchings, and altogether he examined 18,000 prints. 18,000 prints. Now that tells you something. Yes, there are some out there, and just 2 years ago there was Christie sold at London, I think it was, sold 50 Rembrandt etchings from a private collection, and they're there. And compared to modern and contemporary art, they're cheap. There were altogether 50 etchings. I remember at the time doing a little trying to average to see how much they cost. The prices individually went from maybe $6,000 or $7,000 all the way up to $250,000. The average was 45,000, and this is prints that are not little bitty obscure things. These are good-sized prints with various subjects, including a couple of the great ones. And so the average out of all 50 was $45,000 each. So if you have, say $500,000 to spend this year, you'll have no difficulty, I think, finding at least a few really first-rate Rembrandt prints, etchings, although it's always hard to guess which ones are available. That changes a lot. And most of the prints are sold by private dealers, meaning galleries. Not so many in New York, although there are some. There have been some here in Los Angeles. But the place you want to go is London or the continent. It's a good excuse to travel. And I think I would say that you could get print for as low as say $4,000 or $5,000, an etching by Rembrandt, but that might not be a particularly good impression. That didn't maybe start life as the best impression, or was variously was made from a worn, as Rembrandt kept printing from the same plates, a worn plate, and sometimes they're hazards. In other words, there are restrikes made in the so-called, I like that word, when the copper plate outlived Rembrandt, when many of them did, they fell into the hands of people, some of them fairly unscrupulous people, who would either engrave some of the plates using various tools, or just sell rather weak impressions. And those are fairly abundant still out there. So it's good to have expertise if you are going to collect, Claudia. So cultivate the curator of the Grunewald collection at the Hammer Museum. There are something like, I don't know, 35 or 40 in the Grunewald, maybe 30, or the County Museum, if you can get in there somehow while they're closed. There you have almost 60 at last count. And the Huntington has 94, I counted the other day, 94 impressions, all given to them by collectors who formed collections of as many as, 30, 40, 50 prints.
Wow. Well, I will definitely talk to Cynthia Burlingham, who's our wonderful director of the Grunewald Center. And this leads to a question from Jeffrey. He doesn't say it exactly this way, but with 18,000 prints, would Rembrandt have done all of this work himself? Would his studio assistants have worked on these as well? I think we know the answer, but
we don't know exactly how things worked. Rembrandt must have been at the press for a good many impressions from every plate, I would think. And it might well be that when he settled in, the plate was healthy. The inking was fairly uniform over a number of impressions. He might well have had an assistant keep it cranking, keep inking, and keep turning. We don't know. It seems unlikely to me that 18,000 impressions would have been supervised by Rembrandt himself. Maybe supervised, but not actually printed.
Okay, Carmen in the audience, I'm very envious of Carmen because she says that she's going to Oxford to see the Young Rembrandt exhibition next week. And she wants to know if you have any comments about his work from the mid-1620s to the 1630s.
Yes.
Things to look for.
Yes. Have a look at the first lecture in this series of talks. The first one deals with Rembrandt during that period. And you'll see a good many paintings that are in the show, as well as some drawings and prints. That will give you an idea of how I see the artist at this period. But it's a thrilling period. He starts out you wouldn't have picked him out of the group of young artists and coming out of Leiden in the 20s until maybe a couple of years on. And then he begins to distinguish himself very clearly from his teacher in Amsterdam, who was Peter Lustmann. And, by the time he gets to Amsterdam in 1632 to live, he's created quite a good-sized body of work, both in paintings and in drawings. And he's begun to make etchings that I'm going to show more of actually in the next talk, because we'll look at the self-portraits. And you saw one today. You'll see a whole bunch of others, and you'll see a whole lot of them in the Leiden exhibition, because that's where he made them. And you'll be in the town that he grew up in, and with a short walk from the museum. Well, you're going to be actually not in Leiden. You're going to be in Oxford, where the Ashmolean Museum is. But maybe you can slip over to Leiden. It's not that far. You can take a little airplane over to Schiphol, or even take a ferry and go to Leiden and visit the city, walk around, go to the place where Rembrandt's father, the miller, was, and go to the museum there called the Lakenhal, which is a wonderful 17th century building, and it's chock-a-block with early Rembrandt, some of which are on loan to the museum at Oxford, the Ashmolean Museum. Anyway, I hope you have a very good time there.
Yeah, well, side comment, since obviously we are coming to you in the time of COVID, and that's why we're here and not in a physical theater space.
Yeah.
I believe that United States residents are not even allowed in Europe right now. We are allowed in the UK, but not the rest of Europe. So I don't think she can go to Leiden, sadly. I've wanted to go there my whole life. Hopefully, when this is all over, I will hop over there myself. Anyway, okay, new question. This is kind of comical. Stacy asks, in Joseph and Potiphar's Wife, Rembrandt includes the chamber pot under the bed, which seems unusual. Was the purpose to heighten the unseemly aspect of her act?
I don't know if she could have heightened that unseemliness of what she's trying to do with Joseph there. But maybe. I mean, that was such a common piece of furniture in the Dutch bedrooms, the chamber pot. I don't know. I just think maybe it's another touch of realism on the gross side of the scale. Did it have a sexual flavor for the 17th century audience? Was it a kind of a slight kind of a turn of the knife in the ribs of the spectator? Maybe, but it also would have been very commonly found in someone's bedroom. Maybe not an Egyptian bedroom, I don't know, but Rembrandt didn't know from Egyptian bedrooms.
All right, and now we have a question from John. He says, what motivated Rembrandt to create the different states of the crucifixion scene? Was it artistic compulsion, to increase monetary value, or to display virtuosity, or all three?
Yes, John is right 3 times. One thing was, of course, that because it was executed entirely in dry point, and therefore its darks were produced by that so-called burr that you saw. It's that burr that is worn away first. When the plate has gone through the press quite a number of times, gradually that burr gets less and less and less. And at a certain point, the artist has to decide, do I go back at it? Do I work at the plate some more? Rembrandt did that. Rembrandt did that in many cases. We don't have separate states because the work was not something that he needed to test out, in other words, before he just went back to print some more. At a certain point, that print had worn out the possibility for being re-dry pointed, re-etched after more work on the plate. And so he just made a totally dramatic change. He burnished it, burnishing meaning that you take a blunt tool and you work on the plate in such a way that it pushes the lines pushes the face of the copper down into the lines and makes the lines almost disappear. And then he reworked those areas. So it was a kind of making a good thing out of a bad thing, making a different print out of a plate that had done all it could in the first state at first. And I think that must have been the case also of the second one in that twosome that I showed, the first being the three crosses and the other one being Christ presented to the people. There was a similar kind of wearing down of dry point and then a big rework of a good deal of the plate.
What happens to all those plates? Do they still exist?
Many do. I can't remember just what the total number is, but it's something close to 100 or so, and they're scattered around. And most of them were used a lot during the subsequent centuries, mostly the 18th century rather, and passed down. Many museums have a Rembrandt plate or two, but worn down a lot. So they really are not, it's first of all not kosher to still keep printing from them and selling them as Rembrandt. And secondly, the impressions can't be very good because they've been weakened a lot, and they won't take the ink the way they did.
Going back to paper, we have a question from, where did it go? Beth. She asks, where would Rembrandt have procured Japanese paper from? Was there an international trade in that?
Yes, Beth, it was imported. The Dutch were trading with the Far East by then and had really quite a substantial office, a kind of so-called factory or depot in Japan, actually, at a town called Deshima, near Yokohama. And at Deshima, lots and lots of stuff from Japan and elsewhere and that had been imported into Japan was put on Dutch ships and returned, so that, yes, Japanese paper was one of those things in which there was a real commodity, but it was expensive.
Speaking of expensive, why was the 100 guilder print called the 100 guilder print?
Because it sold for that amount, and an impression sold for that amount at some point, I think, still in the 17th century. And 100 guilders is what each of the militiamen paid to have their portrait painted, in some cases at full length, in the Night Watch, the militia portrait by Rembrandt of 1642. So that was a big sum of money to pay for a painting, that is a contemporary painting, and for a piece of paper with ink on it, enormously expensive. So right from the beginning, it was a prized thing. And everybody knew just what a vast amount of work had gone into it just by looking.
And was that, did he call it that as a sort of marketing scheme, or is it just
no,
that?
he didn't need to.
What does that come out to in contemporary dollars?
Good question.
Around, I mean,
good question.
It's not like 100 grand, right? It's like,
no, I should come up with it. Maybe if you'll ask me that question in the next week's Q&A, Claudia, I'll come up with it. In fact, not maybe, I will.
Okay. Let's see. Another question we have is, what was Rembrandt's religious denomination?
Well, he would have called himself, I suppose, a Reformed Protestant. That was the broad middle. That was the official denomination in the Netherlands, though there were others. And Rembrandt didn't have any very orthodox views, I think. He was influenced a lot, of course, by classical thought and reading of the Bible in school. I mean, he went to a Latin school, and the Bible was taught in the vernacular, so translated, in other words, into Dutch. We know he was influenced by Mennonites, who were a liberal kind of Protestant denomination, because he married into a family of Mennonites from Friesland. And this isn't a denomination, but if he had been an ancient Roman, Rembrandt would have been a Stoic. There are lots of Stoic ideas, virtues, embedded in Protestant thought. The ideals, particularly of justice, doing the right thing, courage, meaning moral courage as well as physical courage. And it's down a long list. Compassion, obedience, loyalty. These are not just Christian virtues. The Christian sect, over the centuries, absorbed a great deal of them from other traditions, and certainly inherited them from Rome. He was, of course, he was fascinated by the Bible, and biblical narratives were his real stock in trade, more than any other subjects. The Old Testament and the life of Christ in the New Testament were of interest to him, not primarily, I think, for anything like devotional purposes. He wasn't making these images to be prayed to. He was making them to invite the viewer to think long and slow about the story, which most viewers had absorbed in school or elsewhere. Think about those stories, think about the behavior of the people involved, and think about the lessons one might learn for contemporary life.
Yeah, that makes sense. Paula is asking, was Rembrandt influenced by the Baroque movement? She's thinking of all the dramatic swirls in his religious etchings.
Paula, that's good. Yes. I like to think of him as the Baroque artist. I mean, he's, along with Rubens and several Italians, he's a kind of showcase for those ideas of how to organize a picture, how to energize the figures, how to make their body language relate to each other, how to compose in a way that's not just clear graphically, but exciting, has something of the energy or the devotion sort of baked into the stories. We looked last week at the picture of the sacrifice by Abraham of his son Isaac. And if you ever wanted to pick a single picture that was a perfect example of Baroque ideals, that would be one. So Baroque, as distinct from classical, that's often a distinction that's made. Classical being the designs are not created out of big, continuous curving lines and are not so energized, but are rather more horizontal and symmetrical and all in all lucid and calm and considered. Rembrandt undergoes a change in that direction, and you can see it happen. You'll see it in what we show you next week and the week after. And you've seen a little of that before. The same subject today, for example, that we saw in the 100 guilder print of Christ preaching, which is full of action, is pulled together by a kind of classical organization in the form of a big triangle. And that becomes refined further when he again etches the subject of the Christ preaching, the small version, where he's standing on a kind of stage space. right in the center, and the action is much more sedate, subdued, still. But the excitement comes much more from physical expressions and relationships.
You're talking about the later one being the one with the little boy with the top, right?
I was, yes. Yeah, I was.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting. Those two are so different. To me, they almost look like they're made by different artists.
Why don't we actually look at those for a second? If we can do that, Claudia, is that all right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so let's go to number, because you fixed me up with a little poop sheet here, which is, couldn't be better. Okay, number 69, followed by number 70. Start with 69.
I just feel like the people are more sort of softer in the earlier one and more kind of chunky in the later one.
That's true. First of all, there are very, very many more of them. And secondly, they're in very complex relationships to each other. Look at the left side, for example. There's just a lot of physical activity, lots and lots to look at. Same to the right-hand side of Christ. And there is this device of the sort of upward sweep of figures from the right and the left, forming an apex with Christ in the middle. It's a kind of, it's a composition, to go back to those terms, composition that's full of Baroque mechanisms, but it's subsumed into a big geometrical structure that's quite stable overall. If you'd show the next slide, the next image.
70.
70, yeah. Yeah, he sort of pruned the cast of characters, made them somewhat bigger, elevated Christ. It's a whole lot more stable. And the emotional goings on are not so much expressed by big gestures as they are by expressions. And they're still, and they're all different kinds of absorption. Here, they don't look at each other to question each other so much. There's not that kind of interplay. But they all look like they're giving deep thought to whatever it is, the men on the lower left, and they have lots of little gestures to show their absorption. Just to the left of Christ, the man sitting on the step, one leg slung up, head held by a hand. And the same with the man I mentioned at the bottom, at the Christ's feet, right to the right-hand side of him, completely, again, with the hand gesture, absorbed in what he's hearing. The old woman on the right-hand side, the one who's facing out, sitting on the ground.
Yeah.
So it's an image all about hearing and absorbing, but not so much about having any kind of big expression of wonder, belief, conversion, that kind of thing. It's all happening in the minds, I think.
It's very, very down to earth by comparison. The other one is very sort of mystical and cue the orchestra. And this one feels like real people really thinking it through.
Yeah, that's nice.
These are just spectacular. So Jenny asked a question. You mentioned Rubens' prints, and how can you compare them with Rembrandt's?
Yeah, you know, Rubens, I'm very glad you asked that, because Rubens and Rembrandt are always paired. They lived in the same city that had been rivals, and at a distance they sort of were. Rembrandt was a kind of an original printmaker. Rembrandt had ideas that were suitable for executing in print form. They were seldom repeated compositional ideas that he had painted. Rubens regarded prints, I think, as a way to expand the market for his work, as well as to celebrate and advertise his abilities so that he'd get more commissions. Rembrandt made his own prints right from the beginning to the end. Rubens didn't touch, as far as we know, touch etching or engraving tools, let alone woodcut tools. He had a bunch of, not a bunch of, 2, 3, 4 skilled printmakers who worked at his elbow, or he worked looking over his shoulder, to translate his big ideas into small formats, but into relatively small formats. These are, in many cases, large prints. He even had a woodcut specialist, a man called Christoffel Jäger, to make woodcuts on a big scale, like the ones that were made after Titian's work. They were very conscious of each other. Rubens was very conscious of what Titian had done. Rembrandt was not in the business of selling reproductions of his work. He tried it very briefly, and trained up an etcher in his studio who wasn't terribly good at it. So Rembrandt's model was different. Rembrandt produced with his own hands a very large number of prints, all done in a slightly different way, all showing the evolution, or many of them showing the evolution of how the print was made. They are kind of multiples with a difference. And they were, I think, even in his own time, priced accordingly, and collected very soon after his death avidly by people who knew the difference between one state and another of Rembrandt's etching. This did not happen with Rubens. Rubens was using engraving for the most part and woodcuts to make prints that did justice to the bigness of his designs, and he produced a great many of them, but without any great expenditure of labor on his own part, that is physical labor.
Understood. Kind of a different animal. And that will lead into our final question. But before we go to our last question, I just want to remind everyone that next week, John Walsh will be talking about Rembrandt's self-portraits, and you can RSVP for that lecture on the Hammer website. And now I'm just going to put to you the final question from Barbara, which is, could you comment on Rembrandt's use of animals, which I happen to love?
Yes, no, yes, he didn't use it very much, but you saw the elephant. I hope you saw the elephant in the Adam and Eve. Did you? I think we better, maybe I mentioned it, but I don't think it's really hard to see.
It was lurking behind the dragon.
Yeah, it was. It was behind the dragon. So we should bring back Adam and Eve, and that would be, bring back slide number 39.
And then, of course, there's all the cows and rams and ewes in the...
Yes, yes. Here you go. Now,
I love this.
Squint, we go way down, 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 down. Get your face close to the picture on the screen, and you'll see the elephant lumbering towards Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden, which, who knows? There was an elephant in Amsterdam. I think he had a name, but I've forgotten it. Rembrandt made a couple of wonderful drawings after that elephant, and I think never forgot him. I think it was 1637 that the elephant was around, and Rembrandt made this. And the elephant was, a kind of a benign animal, and he represented some kind of faithfulness, loyalty, which I suppose was kind of a nod towards Adam and Eve's, and maybe an ironical nod towards what Adam and Eve are doing. You also get a really good look at a dragon there. I only showed a detail, but this is great. You get to see the bat wings. And as Claudia said, there are wonderful animals. You should get yourself a good reproduction of the Annunciation of the Shepherds in the early state and look at the drawing of those barnyard animals out there in a field, just all reacting kinetically to this surprising event. This about other animals, yes, he made drawings and etchings of many animals, including dogs, including a trussed up hog who's about to have something quite unpleasant going to happen to him in one of the etchings. And I'm just mentally flipping through. But anyway, there is a menagerie. It's not something he specialized in particularly, but when he wanted to do it, he could do it brilliantly.
And also capture the human animal brilliantly.
That too.
Well, John, one of my favorite things about these lectures is how you basically give us a magnifying glass and show us those little details. It's so thrilling and it's so exciting. I mean, it's just wonderful. Anyway, thank you very much. And I really look forward to next week's talk about Rembrandt's self-portraits. And it's an honor to have you here with us on our Sunday afternoon.
Thank you, Claudia. Thanks to you in the audience. I'm sorry I can't see you one of these days.
Thank you. Good night. Good afternoon.